Welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Research isn't just about methods and data, it's deeply connected to how we see and understand the world. From the assumptions we make to the way we collect data, analyze it, and interpret the results. All of these choices reflect our underlying philosophical position. Maybe you've heard the terms like ontology and epistemology before and felt unsure about what they really mean or why they matter. You've probably read papers and books on the topic, but they often seem abstract or hard to follow. So, what exactly are ontology and epistemology? How do they shape our realist research design and interpretations? And what are the real world implications? Today, we're diving into these questions and more, and I can't think of anyone better but with Ferdie Mukumbang, to speak around this topic. Ferdie, good to see you. How are you?
It's great to see you, Alejandro. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
No problem at all. Thanks to you, because I know that you have so many projects at the moment coming up, and I'm excited to see where they come up. First things first, Ferdy, just for those that are starting with the realist journey, or they may have not read your work just of yet, would you be happy to just share a little bit about yourself and your work in the realist community thus far?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for the opportunity. My work in realist research started off when I was about to embark on my PhD journey. And we went to see the Department of Health in South Africa. And they said they wanted a nuanced way of understanding why some interventions are failing in some of their healthcare facilities and succeeding in other parts or in other facilities within their control. And so while I was sitting there with a senior colleague, and he suggested that maybe we could do a realist evaluation. And that was the first time ever I even heard about the term realist evaluation. I had just completed my master's degree, and then he turned towards me and said, "You could do a realist evaluation for your PhD on this matter." And I'm like, I've never even heard about realist evaluation, talk less of doing a PhD on this. And so while we were driving back to the office, and he started telling me that this was in 2014, that he's just been reading a little bit about realist evaluation, and has realized that it has the potential of sharing an understanding of different contextual conditions and how they could influence the success or failures of interventions, which might have the same characteristics, even delivered by the same people, but will have different success rates in the different facilities. And he said that that is what intrigued him. And when he started sharing that with me, I also felt intrigued. So that is how, when I returned to the office, he said I should start reading up on realist evaluation. And very few materials back then in 2014 that you could read up on, and very few protocols that had been published at that time. And so there was really little material that one could learn from. But luckily, Paulson and Tilly had written realistic evaluation right back in 1997. That was the starting point.
That's fascinating, and I love the story, and particularly the process and the journey you've probably been through as well since then, since 2014, now 11 years from now. How you've probably seen the realist approach grow so much since then, with of course the creation of the Ramses standards and quality standards, publication standards, but also seeing many more of this kind of work being published. How has that journey been for you, from starting from 2014 and thinking, oh, actually, I'm not too sure about what this is the first time I hear it, to now, publishing so much on the topic and being so involved in the realist community?
That is a great question. And funny enough, I actually started reading up on realist evaluation in 2015, even though I first heard about it in 2014. Because in 2014, I was still finishing up a project that I was working on with this professor. And then the whole idea of doing a PhD on realist evaluation kicked in 2015. So that is when I started reading up extensively, because I was trying to write up the proposal for a realist evaluation. And back then, because I did my PhD in South Africa, there was even very little that was even known about realist evaluation. So I started what I would say gleaning information, and I use gleaning because there was so little information out there on practicalities of how to do realist evaluation. And so started gleaning information left, right, and center. And we finally put a proposal together. And when they returned from the ethics committee and the review board, they said that this is one of the most outstanding proposals that they had received. I was shocked because I just realized that I didn't even know what I was doing, but it was a lot of learning through that process. And through then, I have seen the field grow seriously and really so excited. And I was keen to attend my first realist evaluation conference in Liverpool, because now this was in 2016 that it took place, and I had completed my protocol. So I submitted my protocol for presentation. For the PhD, there is always a pre-conference workshop for PhDs. So I also presented my proposal there, and we had people who already had some experience, like Sonia Dalkin, who had already experienced. There was Paulson there and Tilly. So you could now I started sharing my ideas on this PhD with them, and then we started receiving some nuggets of information that they were sharing with us. But since we returned, a lot of people started working in realist work, and it has really been growing. And I'm really happy to see how much it has grown. And we still have a long way to go to really make realist evaluation as established as other fields. But I'm also very proud of us, the realist community, of how far we have come to where we are even really looking at even having Ramses that are there to guide our publication standards and even how to evaluate realist research.
Okay, thank you so much. That is fantastic. And you'll have so many different learnings and experiences which we can really look into today, because I'm sure that one of the things that, as you went into your realist journey, was learning all about these two words that often seem quite alienating, which is ontology and epistemology, or the philosophical basis of realism. And for me personally, this was one of the light bulb moments when I understood, and I use understood with a little u, not with a capital U, because there's so much philosophy that you can go into and the depths of it. And wow, it's fascinating. I find it so interesting. But once this made click in my head, I personally understood, the decisions that you're making at every time of your analysis, of your design, of your interpretations, of your program theory development. So I'm really excited to talk further about this and the learnings that you've gone through as well of, not knowing about realist evaluation to then getting an understanding of around the philosophical position. But I guess just as a very initial starting point, just to get us warmed up, in very simple terms, how would you define ontology and epistemology?
Those are two terms that really scared me when I started doing realist work. And I'm sure other novice and people who are just getting into realist work or PhD level research will also be facing. And I would tell you why. The reason is because when I started reading the material that was available back then, what we had was that most papers will say this work is informed by realism. That is usually how they will start the methodological section. Or realist evaluation is informed by realism. Realism is the ontology informing our realist evaluation. Others, you would read some other papers, it will say our realist evaluation is informed by critical realism. And that is where my confusion now started. And I started asking myself, what is the distinction between realism and critical realism? Because in some papers, some authors will say realist evaluation is informed by realism, and others will say it is informed by critical realism. And others who are now more knowledgeable will say it is embedded within scientific realism. And so I now realize that for me to be able to understand what I'm trying to do here, I need to go deeper and first of all start by understanding all these constructs and knowledge around ontology and epistemology, because some of these authors will say the ontological foundation of realist evaluation is realism. And so if you don't understand what they mean there by ontology within that sentence, then you will not even make a sense of what they're trying to say there. And so I had to return. I'm like, okay, let's go back to the basics. Even though it's not the basics, it's actually the highest level. And what is ontology in the first place? And I realized that ontology simply means your viewpoint of the world. How do you see the world? How do you construct the world in your mind, and how do you think that the world operates? That is the first point. Your understanding or your conceptualization of how the world operates is the ontological position. And related to that now is epistemology, which is saying then, how can we understand how things operate? So your epistemology now provides you with the tenets or the principles that you can use to understand how the world as you perceive it or as you conceptualize it or construct it can be understood. So those are two ways I could, in my mind, understand how those two terms are related. And mind you, I am not a philosopher. I've never studied philosophy. And so this is me coming from a very practical perspective, especially someone who is trained as a nurse, to returning into a philosophical world where you have to be seeing things in the abstract. And so I kept questioning myself, how do I draw my practice from the abstract? How does the abstract inform my practice? And yes, these abstract, as we call it, does inform our practice. Your ontological points of view, your ontological construction of the world, as you think it is operating, informs the approach with which you try to study the world, and definitely the practice, how you practice within this world using the lenses that you have.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much, because that is such a practical way to understand both words that can be very quickly very complicated. And actually, I love the word that you say there of lens, because the podcast and the name is based on this topics as well, which is the realist lens, right? So the glasses that you're seeing the world, because that same problem or same phenomena that you're interested in, or that same evaluation, depending on these two things, how you see the world or how things operate, it's going to really change the angle that you're trying to view that.
Absolutely. The reason why lens to me is also very critical is because I have done quantitative research informed by the positivist lens. I have done qualitative research informed by constructivism or interpretivism. And I have done work in critical realism, even though most is in critical realism. However, I have done work in these two areas. And whenever I am doing that work, I have to take out whatever lens I was using previously, if it was my reading glasses or the driving one. If I want to read, I take off the driving glasses and put it down and wear the reading glasses because I want to read. So if I want to do a constructivist work, for instance, I recently did some work on the perception of migrants in South Africa on vaccine hesitancy. And so I could use a realist lens to understand the drivers or the mechanisms behind whether they wanted to vaccinate or not during COVID. But I decided that I just wanted to understand the barriers and their facilitators to vaccinating or getting the COVID-19 vaccine. And so in that work, I decided to put on my constructivism lens within it. So that is how you could see now, and it's why it's important that your podcast has the word realist lens there. So if somebody is getting here, they should know that there is a particular lens they need to have on to understand what we're talking about.
Thanks, Ferdie. Fascinating. It's a tool in your toolkit, right? And it's another area that really helps you expand your horizons when it comes to your research and the questions you're trying to ask. And that's where this one comes in, because you mentioned around the questions we're trying to ask and that realist lens. And I guess the question is, what is that realist lens? We've defined ontology, how we see the world, epistemology, how things operate within that perception of the world. So, what is then the realist lens? What is the realist philosophy of science? What are the ontological and epistemological positions of a realist position?
A realist lens, I'm going to start by saying that came as the latest child on the block. We already have had positivism, which was the firstborn child of the parents we can call research or evidence finding or whatever you want to say. But positivism came in as the firstborn child. And then later on, constructivism came on saying that, hey, not everything has to be objective. There is also a subjective perspective. My worldview should also count or should be what is of importance. The way I feel pain, the way I perceive things, the way I see things should be most important than just generalizing and making associations. And so constructivism slash interpretivism came in as the second born child. And it's only later on then that realism came in as a philosophical position. And so a lot of authors now position realism between positivism and constructivism, saying that it has come in to resolve the inverted commas, open and close paradigm wars. A lot of people have argued that there had never been any war. It was just different perspectives of seeing things. However, when they said paradigm wars, it was just saying that they have different opinions about how the world is or their world views, their ontology, so to say. Positivists viewed the world differently from constructivists. And so realists now also came with their own lens and said, okay, there are some elements about you positivists that are true, or yeah, and there are some elements about you constructivists that is true. We can obtain knowledge about the world objectively, as positivists argue. However, a person's perspective, worldview, is also important in understanding or in constructing knowledge objectively. And so that's how they thought that they resolved that argument, where they're saying that, hey, we can construct knowledge objectively, like the positivists say. However, how we go about it is different. We can also take people's worldviews, their own perspectives, their own feelings, their own experiences, which is what constructivists advocate for and have as their worldview. And they say reality is what I perceive. Reality is what I experience. Reality is what I go through. And so realists say that, yes, those elements can be harnessed to construct knowledge in an objective way.
So it seems, Ferdie, like this third child, which is realism, became a peacemaker between the two others and stands more or less in between the middle, that there is this, how we see the world, this ontology that is more objective, or there is a real world out there that exists. However, how we perceive that reality, that objective world, and how things operate, people, depending on many factors in the way that they're educated, their culture, their experiences, that objective reality that's out there may be subjectively interpreted. Would that be a fair reflection?
Indeed, that would be a fair reflection, but it goes deeper than this. And it's where we start getting into the whole arena of mechanisms and structures, because it's not so much of your experience that is of interest That's of interest to me. But what is it that made you to go through that experience? And having experienced that, how did you act? That then leads me now to understand behavioral patterns based on the experiences you had. So that is how the knowledge you share with me or your experiences you shared with me, contrary to how constructivists will interpret it, is different from how a realist person will interpret it. A realist person will be looking at, so what are the underlying causes of your change of behavior or of you maintaining that behavior? What is it about the circumstances you were going through that made you to act in a certain way? Whereas constructivists will lean onto the narrative that you have offered. That's why you have an analysis like narrative, discourse analysis, narrative analysis, because the focus is on how that person is feeling, their perception. But realists say that, but we can go deeper and be able to unpack how a particular law or a particular principle existing in a company influenced somebody's attitude towards the company and which consequently informed their behavior towards something. So realists tend to go a little bit much deeper.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ferdie. And that goes into now the implications when it comes to designing your study or even analyzing your data or making decisions where that depth comes in. It becomes really, really important because one of the key implications from a realist perspective is this element of ontological depth, right? That there's this deep ontology that's happening. And I know that, for example, Justin Jagos, who uses this iceberg metaphor, right? Where there's these things happening in the surface, but the realist is interested at the bottom of the iceberg, at all those
Absolutely.
things that in this real world seems to be hidden, but they have powers, they have effects, they have impacts into the things that we're doing. Would you like to go a little bit more deep into, no pun intended, into that deep ontology?
Absolutely. That is one of the things that fascinated me about realism in general, and in particular, critical realism. Now, remember from the beginning, I mentioned that there was realism that was mentioned in some of the papers I read. Some of them mentioned scientific realism informing realist evaluation, and others mentioned critical realism that is informing their work. All these added to my confusion. And so I set out now to try to understand, are these similar terms that people are using interchangeably, or do they differ? And if they differ, in what ways do they differ? What is the relationship between realism, critical realism, and scientific realism? Now, it will be important for me to explain this before I now go into this deep ontology that we are about to discuss. So I realized as I'm maturing in realist work that I will have some schools will defend realist evaluation as being scientific, scientific realism, and others from the critical realist point of view, Pascalian critical realism, have some nuanced understanding of even how to unpack what mechanism is. But first and foremost, let me try to find the differences and the similarities and explain them in the way I have understood it over the years and through my readings. First, indeed, Paulson and Tilly shared in their book that realist evaluation was formulated from scientific. In fact, they use the term applied scientific realism. Applied being very, very important term there. It simply meant that they wanted things to be more practical. They wanted people to be able to apply realist understandings in real world practice and research. So that is what they were going for. So there's also the school of critical realism. Now, critical realism is a field that was built by a lot of philosophers. However, it is credited to Basker because he did a lot of work in that area. There's also some other people like Lawson, Tony Lawson, and you have Asher who also contributed, and many more who contributed towards what we have today as critical realism. Critical realism and scientific realism are children of realism. Realism, to me, even have other branches when I was doing research about this. There is historical realism. I saw so many different terms, but in the literature, two main forms of realism are really prominent: critical realism and scientific realism. Scientific realism focuses on the art of science. That is the key distinction between scientific realism and critical realism. Scientific realism, the term refers scientific, focuses on the art of science, meaning that it wants to help us, based on a realist philosophical mind, to be able to do research informed by the principles of realism. And so its drive is towards methodological foundation. Its drive is towards establishing a methodological approach that is informed by realist principles. And so that is why it has three key constructs that it focuses on. Mind independence, which you had mentioned that there's an objective truth out there and we are seeking to understand it. So in scientific realism, they're arguing that whatever we do, we can only understand that truth by formulating theories. But we can never change the truth out there in spite of our conceptualization, in spite of the language you use, in spite of the approach you use towards understanding the world out there. Mind independence, that means that whatever is going through your mind does not affect or impact what the real truth is out there. And so another principle now comes down, which they called the semantic notion of research. And semantic notion simply means that we can use theories to understand the world. In spite of the fact that it is out there and it is mind independent, we can understand or explain that world out there by theorizing. And then comes the next notion, which is the epistemic notion, which says that you can use different sources of information, whichever suits your, whichever arsenal is available to you at that time, to formulate your theories. It even can be out of your mind. You can do abduction. It can come from experience. It can come from observing other people. It can come from doing RCTs. It can come from conducting interviews. But the use of these different tools to formulate theories that can explain reality is what is called the epistemic view. So Paulson and Tilly now focused on using these aspects of realism to build what we have as realist evaluation. To this end, their focus was on coming up with a methodological approach through which we can use to do research to understand our programs, policies, and whatever phenomenon we are interested in. And boy, did they succeed in doing that.
Ferdie, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for going into that complex world and just trying to demystify it a little bit, because sometimes it can feel a little bit out of reach. All this that you mentioned around scientific realism and all these different key tenets that it has when it comes to realist evaluation and realist synthesis, This is going to be so important, I guess, for the implications then of your study and your research and the decisions that you make. So, as a researcher, what are the implications of subscribing to this view of the world? What are the implications of taking this ontological and epistemological stance of scientific realism? What is that going to mean as you go into your study, as you go into your analysis, as you go into building theories? What does that mean?
Absolutely. This is a brilliant question. And you would really see as I'm explaining further now how this relates to everything. I had explained earlier that the semantic notion of scientific realism is that we can use theories to explain reality. This now translates into practice. Why realist evaluation is focused on theory building, theory testing. Those are the terms you would always see in realist work. They are focused on theory. Now, this did not just come out of the blue. It is informed by the semantic notion of scientific realism that theories are a valuable way of understanding reality. Therefore, in realist evaluation, our focus is on theorizing how an intervention works, why it works, for whom and under what circumstances. We seek to theorize, explain, provide an explication of things going through mechanisms as a causal element to explain our observation. And so that then is how the epistemology of semantic notion trickles down into our realist mind of theory seeking. And so when you are analyzing your realist data, your focus is on formulating theory. It's not on unpacking barriers and facilitators. If you want to do that, you can do a constructivist work that can say these are the barriers, these are the facilitators. But if you're doing a realist work, you need to go beyond barriers and facilitators. You need to go beyond the simple fact that availability of finances will make the program work. The next question is, how exactly does it do that? Why does it do that? So realists then go deeper, like you said, having this iceberg where we observe that there is this change at the empirical level or out there. But then now at the bottom, what is causing this change of behavior that we are seeing? Because we can see an event happening, we can see the change happening. But what is at the origin of this change? And so that is exactly how you see this philosophical understanding trickling into the practical work we do by focusing on theorizing. And its semantic notion is simply saying that, hey, to understand reality, to understand the world, we need to formulate theories. And so that's why realist evaluation focuses on theories. Now, another example, let's now use the epistemological component of the epistemological component of scientific realism, which says you can use whatever method that is available to you to be able to formulate these theories. It can be from your thought. It can be from experience. It can be from practice, which can inform you and abductively put together a theory. And then later on, test that theory to see if it reflects reality. That is why in realist evaluation, you would always hear that it is method neutral. This is coming from its epistemological position that you can use anything at all. It is method neutral, saying that use whatever approach, quant, qual, mixed, photo voice, narration, stories, whatever. But explain to us how this approach that you are using is leading you towards formulating those theories. And so another component of epistemology is now who is telling you the story? Whose opinion are you getting? From where are you getting the information that you are getting towards formulating your program theories or your theories. Let's use that in general. So the epistemic view says whoever is relevant, whoever can provide you the relevant information towards providing the and how understanding how this program works is a good source. And so that's how we now just say nowadays that realist evaluation is method neutral. That didn't just come from anywhere. It is informed by the epistemological position of scientific realism.
What that demonstrates again is that all of these methods and all of these decisions that we're making, if you track back, it all goes back to that philosophy. It all goes back to these positions, to those lenses of viewing the world. And I guess that when it comes to justifying your approach, when it comes to comments from editors or in a viva for PhD students, or when explaining realist world, this is why I think starting sometimes in this area, these are like building the foundations of the tower, right? Then everything that then you've explained from these areas and these different elements can be aligned. This ontological, epistemological, methodological alignment.
I couldn't agree more. And to be honest, this is one thing that I learned from doing realist work that I'm trying to transfer into my other work. The trickling down from the ontological position, the epistemology, the methodology, the methods, and the results. So even now, before when I started doing my core work, I did a lot of work in phenomenology, but I did not unpack it at these different levels. But nowadays, if I'm writing a phenomenological paper, for example, I start by shedding where phenomenology comes from, the whole idea about it, and then the key tenets of phenomenology, which is digging into the experiences, the lived experiences of the person that you are talking to. Why are you targeting them? Because they have had that experience you are interested in. They have been exposed to the phenomenon. And so I try to bring this now and trickle down the same tree of ontology, epistemology, and methods and down. So this is one thing I've learned from realist work that I'm trying to transfer to my other core work and quant.
I love that, Ferdie, because I think that's such an important area. And I know that a lot of the time, there's practical decisions that you have to make, like word count limitations, etc. But I think it does add so much value when you understand where this is coming from. And it's not about being right or wrong. It's about the lenses that you're viewing. And that makes your results and your study make so much more sense, at least from the position that you're going through. There's so much that we've spoken about, Ferdie, and I'm so happy to have had you in and had these conversations around ontology and epistemology that can feel very, very alien, as I mentioned, but I think that you've done a fantastic job in bringing it into practical terms. Just as a final question, because there'll be researchers or PhD students or people new to realism that are trying to understand these questions as well, and they're trying to grapple with the philosophy of the realist philosophy of science. What would be your three top tips, your three pieces of advice you would give to those individuals that are grappling now with the ontology and epistemology and realist work? What are the three top tips, would you say, that could be super useful in order to continue their learning and continue their understanding of ontology and epistemology from a realist philosophy of science?
This is very practical. And that's a brilliant question. Number one, please do not start by reading Bascar's books. You are going to be so lost and you probably will hate your PhD journey. I tried doing that. It was horrible. His writing is so philosophical. If you are not a philosophy major, you're going to struggle. So what I did, and I went in the opposite direction. I didn't start off as a philosopher coming down to methodology and being practical. I started from a practical point of view, going up towards philosophy. And so I read the works of other people who have tried to interpret Pascal's work, because those people now tried to decode a lot of the strong terminology and conceptualizations that he had in his books. And so I first of all read these commentaries or articles of the different components of what Basquiat has written. And so having understood those from those writers, I now started attempting to read Basquiat's books directly, and which now started making a lot of sense because somebody else somehow had explained it in their own writing. So, a word of advice, if you're interested in going deep into the philosophy of realism, scientific and critical realism, is start by the more friendlier literature on this. A lot of people have written on this nowadays, but start on a more friendlier approach. Number two, I think that Jeff mentioned this. It is important to have people who have experience in realist work in your team. Now, I'm speaking this one from experience. I have had a friend who is doing his PhD, did not have a realist person on their PhD committee, and really struggled a lot to navigate the journey. Really had a lot of challenges because, according to what he explained, he was being stirred towards constructivism, even though in his mind he had wanted to do a realist informed work. And so, because now the advisors were not so used to realist work, they had to steer him away from that so that they could advise him better in a field that they know better. And then the third work is trust yourself, trust your understanding of things. Realist work is very interpretive in its nature. Try to bounce off your ideas with other people and see if your interpretation of things makes sense. Because even most people operating in realist world, Basquiat himself said that the theory that you come up with must reflect reality. And so speaking to other people, they can share you other versions of reality as they see it. And you can put those together to now build the puzzle that you're trying to build.
Number one, not Bhaskar first, decode the concepts. Number two, gathering a good team. And number three, trust your understanding. Ferdie, that's a little cookbook there for anyone who's trying to go into the realist philosophy of science. And I think those are very three good practical tips to leave listeners in. Ferdie, it's been absolutely a pleasure having you in. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing all your stories, your explanations, your experiences, and to bring this philosophical concepts very practically to life. For anyone listening, thank you so much for listening to The Realist Lens, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you soon again, Ferdie. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I look forward to seeing you next time.